All right, we are now recording, and let's open up with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for giving us this time to study the evidence of your existence, the evidence that you really did create this universe, this world, and I pray that this class will be beneficial and understandable. We can take what we learn and share it with others, that glory will be given to you and more souls will be brought to your Son. We ask all this in his name. Amen. All right, so you'll notice on the screen, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Sir. Yep.
So you'll notice on the screen that the title of tonight's class is Creation versus Evolution. And I think we all understand creation, the term creation, and what that implies, but I'd like for us to look into the definition of evolution because it's very important when you're discussing things like this with anyone to define the definitions of the terms that you're using, because if you don't do that, then misunderstanding, confusion can result in that, and it's very difficult to overcome those hurdles once they're there. So with this class, with this audience, I think creation is understood, but let's define evolution starting out. Now, the assertion is made that evolution has occurred on Earth, and the most important aspect of this claim centers on what is meant by that. When you're talking about evolution, if what you're referring to is that living organisms have the genetic ability to alter their appearance in minor ways over a period of time, then that is a scientifically proven fact. That is something that is both readily accepted by not only evolutionists, but also creationists as well. And you see it all the time. I mean, we call it microevolution. And that is the explanation for the different kinds of cats and dogs and the different kinds of horses and things of that nature. So when you're talking about evolution, if you're referring to microevolution, then that is scientifically proven. Does that make sense? Everyone understand that? But then when you say evolution, if you are meaning that organisms can genetically mutate into other kind of organisms, and that this will take place over millions of years, the gradual changing from simple organisms like amoebas into complex organisms like human beings, then what we're going to see in tonight's class is that the evidence doesn't support that assertion, and this theory is what scientists call macroevolution. And that is presented, I mean, it's technically still called a theory, but it's presented in many forums as factual, but the science doesn't actually prove that. So does that make sense? Does everyone understand the difference between microevolution and macroevolution? Mm-hmm. See, a lot of people will get confused when one definition is used. You say evolution, but then it's replaced with a definition that not everyone agrees upon. It's almost like how a card sharp uses sleight of hands. To give you an example, science writers and science textbooks often state that evolution is a fact, and what they'll do is they'll point to tiny variations in the size of a finch's beak, or they'll point to how in the population of moths that there are different colors. Or they'll look at dogs and they'll say, well, look at this dog. This dog's neck is longer than this dog's over here. And they'll say, well, those minor differences prove evolution. Well, what kind of evolution are they talking about?
Microevolution.
Yeah, they're talking about microevolution, and they would be correct because the evidence does show that microevolution is a fact. But then they say that since evolution is a proven fact, then that's how we know that monkeys and humans evolved from a common ancestor. But you see, now they're talking about a different kind of evolution. Now they're talking about macroevolution, and that is not scientifically proven. And when you pay close attention, you can see the trick that's being pulled here, how the definition of evolution is switched from microevolution, small changes within the same type of organism, to macroevolution, huge genetic changes that turns one kind of animal into another kind of animal. And so when you understand this situation, that's very important, especially when you're dealing with, or when you're reading science books and magazines. Is that any questions so far, or any comments? Well, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. July 14th, 2006 issue of Science magazine. The couple on the screen were, they presented a paper. This is Peter and Rosemary Grant. The title of their paper is Evolution of Character Displacement in Darwin's Finches. Now, one of the events in Charles Darwin's life that got him to study evolution was that he went to the Galapagos Islands, and while he was there, he saw different kinds of finches, and he observed minor differences in these different types of finches. Now, in this article, the thesis of this article was that there was a severe drought out there. And during the drought, there was one particular type of finch that is circled on the screen, and that particular finch evolved a slightly smaller beak. And the reason why it evolved a smaller beak was because a different kind of finch showed up and began competing for larger seeds of a certain kind of plant. Now, that's what the article is bringing out. Now, there was an Associated Press author named Randall Schmid, and he wrote about this article in Science magazine. And here's how he opened his summary of their findings. He says, finches on the Galapagos Islands that inspired Charles Darwin to develop the concept of evolution are now helping to confirm it by evolving. Now, notice what Mr. Schmid did in his introduction here. He combined two separate definitions of evolution into his statement, and he falsely equated both of them. He falsely equated the two. See, when most people think of Darwin's concept of evolution, what do they think of? Do they think of microevolution, or do they think of macroevolution?
Macro.
Macroevolution. Yes, when you think of what Darwin says about evolution, they define it as huge genetic changes that turn one kind of animal into another. That's what is called Darwinism, macroevolution. But the evolving that the finches on the Galapagos Islands were doing was not macroevolution, it was microevolution. It was small changes within the same type of organism. There was a finch that evolved a smaller type of beak. He didn't change from a finch into something else. He still remained a finch, but he evolved in his beak size. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Well, they're not the same thing here, but Schmid in his article talked about them as if they were the same thing. Now, he went on to interview a man by the name of Robert Flesher. Robert Flesher is a scientist who works with the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Now, Mr. Flesher, in his interview with Mr. Schmid, he stated that the Grants had merely documented an instance of microevolution, small changes within the same type of organism. But the title, and you'll notice I boldened the title, if you can see at the bottom there. The title of the article that Mr. Schmid wrote, Finches on Galapagos Islands Evolving, and notice the top, the title of the article that the Grants wrote, Evolution of Character Displacement in Darwin's Finches. Those titles imply that it was Darwinian evolution, that it was macroevolution, that it was huge changes in genetics that turned one kind of animal into another, that was what has been proven here by this research. And in fact, Mr. Schmid goes so far as to make this claim in his introductory paragraph. Finches on the Galapagos Islands that inspired Charles Darwin to develop the concept of evolution are now helping to confirm it by evolving. Well, they are evolving, but it's just their beaks that are evolving. That's a far cry from the evolution that Charles Darwin was promoting, which is an animal changes into a different kind of animal. An organism changes into a different kind of organism. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So what do the finches of the Galapagos Islands really prove? What they prove is that finches stay finches. What they prove is that the only documented kind of evolution is microevolution, small changes within the same kind of organism. Now, the couple here, Peter and Rosemary Grant, they have been studying finches for 33 years. And what did they say about this change in beak size from the larger beak all to the smaller beak here? What did they change to it? And that change is about 0.6 millimeters in beak length and 0.8 millimeters in beak depth. Here's what they said about it in their article. They said that it is the strongest evolutionary change seen in the 33 years of the study. 33 years, and the strongest change that they saw when it came to evolution was 0.6 millimeters in beak size, 0.8 millimeters in beak depth. That's the strongest evolutionary change in 33 years. The finches did not turn into cows. The finches did not turn into dogs. There was no macroevolution. All there was from a large beak to a small beak, microevolution, small changes in beak size. That's the only evolutionary process that they observed in 33 years. And what's even more interesting and more ironic is the fact that this change to a smaller beak in finches that was supposed to help the finches survive. And remember, they're calling this change evolutionary. They're saying that Charles Darwin says that it's evidence that proves his survival of the fittest theory. Well, in actuality, it doesn't prove survival of the fittest, because in that same article for Science, the couple here, the Grants, they alluded to research that they had done in 1977 when a drought struck that same island and killed many of the finches. And here's what they said. In 1977, most finches died that year, and mortality was heaviest among those with small beaks. Now, here's what they're meaning by that. If the finch with the smaller beak, the finch that evolved to have the smaller beak, then even though he evolved, it took nothing more than a drought to easily bring about his demise. And that what's the point of Charles Darwin's theory about survival of the fittest? What is evolution supposed to make possible? Does anyone know?
Just the survival of their surroundings. They're adapting so that they can better succeed in the surroundings they're faced with.
Exactly. So you would think that the smaller beak size that evolution brought on would have helped the finch to survive, but it didn't. And so the article's not even really proving what Charles Darwin's theory was really all about, survival of the fittest. Any questions or comments so far? The thing is that scientific observation has never, ever produced a single shred of evidence that proves even the possibility of macroevolution. Again, macroevolution being huge genetic changes that turns one animal into another. All the evidence in science that we have ever observed points to every living organism producing only after its own kind. Microevolution. If there's any changes, the organism stays the same, even though those changes happen. And that's exactly what the Bible brings out in Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 and 25. And I'll read that to you. Genesis 1, verses 24 and 25, it says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." That's exactly what biology teaches. How many of you have heard of the law of biogenesis? Does that sound familiar? You remember that from biology class? The biogenesis is basically two words: bio, which means life, and genesis, which means beginning, the beginning of life. So the law of biogenesis deals with the beginning of life, and this law basically states that in this material universe, life comes only from previous life of its own kind, which is exactly what Genesis says in the Bible. And you see this every day. You see that in this world that we live in. Kittens only come from female cats. Cows will produce calves. Puppies will come only from dogs. That's Katie up there when she was a baby with Beth. Human beings come from human beings. A pig never gives birth to a horse. A sheep never produces an iguana. An ape never produces a human being. Now, for those of you who attended the class a couple of weeks ago, do you remember how I brought out that scientist Carl Sagan, that he estimated the chances of life coming about through evolution on this planet is basically one chance out of basically one followed by 2 billion zeros? If you're going to write that number on the screen, you would need 6,000 books, and each one of those 6,000 books would need to have 300 pages. The probability of life coming about because of macroevolution is infinitesimally small. And the reason why this is true is because the theory of macroevolution relies very heavily on ideas which violate this basic recognized law of science, which is the law of biogenesis, that life comes only from previous life of its own kind. And what's interesting is that the Bible very, very clearly states in Genesis 1, verses 24 and 25, that animals are made according to their own kinds, and that's exactly what the law of biogenesis says. Does that make sense? Any thoughts, questions anyone has? See, over the years, there have been thousands of scientists that have documented how true the law of biogenesis is. Now, anyone have any idea who that guy is? His name is Louis Pasteur. Have you ever heard of Louis Pasteur? What's Louis Pasteur known for?
Pasteurization.
That's right. He's the reason your milk is in your refrigerators right now. Well, here's something else that Louis Pasteur did. He blew that notion right out of the water, that life arises on its own from non-living sources, or what scientists call spontaneous generation. He blew that notion right out of the water. Here's what people believed before Louis Pasteur in earlier centuries. A lot of people believed that life came from non-living things. You know, we think today that we're so advanced now, thinking that we believe in Darwinian evolution, that we're so progressive. But in reality, macroevolution promotes nothing more than the superstitions that people used to have. There was a time when people believe, they actually believe that a person could take wheat grains and wrap them in an old rag and stuff them in the corner of a barn, and mice would be produced from the wheat grains. People actually believe that. And here's what else they used to believe. They used to believe that if you took old meat and you just left it on the kitchen counter for a while, that the meat would generate maggots spontaneously. People used to believe that. But you see, then Louis Pasteur comes along and he proves that all of this is nothing more than a myth when he disproves the concept of spontaneous generation through his well-designed scientific experiments. Science teachers and professors today, they recognize this. They pointed it out in their classrooms, and believe it or not, so do evolutionists. There is an evolutionist by the name of Martin Moe. He wrote an article called Genes on Ice for Science Digest, and he said correctly, a century of sensational discoveries in the biological sciences has taught us that life arises only from life. One of the most prominent evolutionists, George Gaylord Simpson, him and his colleagues, when they wrote their textbook, their science textbook, Life: An Introduction to Biology, he wrote, there is no serious doubt that biogenesis is the rule, that life comes only from other life, that a cell, the unit of life, is always and exclusively the product or offspring of another cell. But here's the thing, right after saying this, in almost the same breath, these same teachers and these same professors will tell their students that non-living chemicals produced living organisms sometime in the distant past. They'll say that Louis Pasteur is right, and then in the next minute they'll say that it's a proven fact that spontaneous generation is true. They'll say Louis Pasteur is right. Life rises from only life, and then they'll turn around. They'll say life rises from non-life. It's very inconsistent, and they also will attack another scientifically proven view, and that is that life came about as the result of being created. Here's an article by an atheist named Frank Zindler. And the title of the article is Creation Science and the Facts of Evolution. This is posted on the American Atheists website. And so that tells me that the American atheists agree with the sentiments that are in the article here. And here's what the article's about. It's a very critical, very sarcastic attack against creation. And not only the idea of creation, but also attacking any person that believes in creation. What Zindler tries to do here is discredit creation. He informs his readers in the article that most people who believe in creation are, quote, devoid of any understanding of logic. And one of the reasons he thinks creation is not a practical idea is, as he put it, on the other hand, those components of creationism, which involve certain types of magical events, make the claims of creationism untestable, making creationism not a theory at all, because theories must be testable. Now, remember that he said that. Remember that he said that theories must be testable, because he would then go on to explain that the conclusion that evolution has occurred is drawn from two simple observations. Observation number one, that living things come only from living things. Spontaneous generation is not possible when living things are already in existence. And then observation number two, fossil remains show that living things in the remote past were very different from living things today. And the conclusion that he makes is that life has changed through time or evolved. So what he's done here is he's presented his strongest case for evolution, what I want to do is analyze what he's saying here. Because remember, he said that creationists are devoid of any understanding of logic. And he also said that creation cannot qualify as a theory because it is untestable and theories must be testable. So let's apply his own standards and his own rules to his first observation. His first observation was living things come only from living things. A spontaneous generation is not possible when living things are already in existence. So what he's implying here is that life can spontaneously generate when there is not already light. In his article here,
Hello.
footnote,
Hello.
observation, he kind
I just did.
of elaborates on it. And in this footnote, what he says is life cannot originate now for at least two reasons. And the two reasons that he listed was, number one, oxygen in the atmosphere would completely destroy the compounds necessary for life. And then also existing microbes would eat the compounds that are necessary for life. And what he goes on to conclude is that neither of these roadblocks to spontaneous generation existed before life had formed. Now, he is saying, remember, that the most important rule for dubbing any theory legitimate is that you have to test it. So can we test spontaneous generation? He says that life cannot originate spontaneously due to oxygen and microbes destroying the compounds necessary for life. Well, is it possible for us to do experiments that would test whether or not spontaneous generation could occur in an environment without oxygen and microbes to destroy the compounds for life? And the answer is, yeah, we can experiment on that. And every single one of these experiments, which attempts to produce life in oxygen-free environments and microbe-free environments, has failed miserably, every single one of them. There is not a scientist anywhere at any time, under any circumstance, that has ever been able to perform an experiment that could prove that spontaneous generation occurs. Every single circumstance that humans have ever been able to observe or imagine it, spontaneous generation has failed. In fact, every experiment, even up to today, has proven that. We cannot prove that our planet's atmosphere at some point in the past did not have oxygen and did not have microbes. In fact, the opposite has been proven. Scientists have credible evidence that the early Earth's atmosphere did in fact contain oxygen. And we have also performed experiments that imitate an environment that does not have oxygen and microbes. And remember, that's what Zindler says, that keeps life from creating itself. We've been able to make such an environment, and there is still, in that environment, there's never been a verified case of spontaneous generation ever. And so spontaneous generation has been proven false. And so if Mr. Zindler says that creationism cannot be a legitimate theory because you can't test it, then he needs to be willing to say the same thing about the theory of evolution, because the strongest case that he has for evolution is based on an idea that has been tested and it's been proven to be false. Does that make sense? Any questions or comments anyone has? Here on the screen is a professor by the name of Robert Hazen. And you see his credentials on the screen here. I mean, his education's amazing here. I mean, he has a bachelor's, a master's from MIT, he has a PhD from Harvard. He's a research scientist. He's written 19 books, 250 articles. I mean, he is, his credentials are very impressive. But here's the thing, about 15 years ago, he taught a course called The Origins of Life. This was a series of 24 lectures that were each a half hour long. And in these lectures, he made some very conspicuous admissions about the scientific community's knowledge about the origin of life on Earth. In the first lecture, here's what he says. First and perhaps foremost, this course is unusual because at this point in time, there is so much that we do not know about how life emerged on Earth. There is a popular misconception that scientists know it all, that we have answers to every possible questions. Well, that is just absurd. There are huge gaps in our understanding. He went on to say, the origin of life has been a subject of immense complexity, and I have to tell you right up front, we do not know how life began. It is as if we are trying to assemble a huge jigsaw puzzle. We have a few pieces clumped together here and there, but most of the puzzle pieces are missing. What is more, we have lost the box top, so we are not even sure what the complete picture is supposed to look like. So here you have this very prominent scientist and professor, and he's admitting that science knows hardly anything about the origin of life here on Earth. And then after he does that, Dr. Hazen then comments on the possibility that the origin of life might be outside the realm of scientific experiments. He says, I have to be honest, even with a scientific approach, there is a possibility that we will never know, in fact, that we can't ever know how life emerged. That is because it is possible that life emerged by an almost infinitely improbable sequence of difficult chemical reactions. And if that is true, then any scientific attempt to understand life's origin is doomed to failure. You see, an infinitely improbable succession of chemical steps cannot be duplicated in a program of lab experiments. If the origin of life was an infinitely improbable accident, then there is absolutely nothing you or I or anyone else could do to figure out how it happened. And then notice what he says next. I must tell you, that's a depressing thought to someone like me who has devoted a decade to understanding the origin of life. Now, there are a few things that I want us to notice here. Number one, Dr. Hazen is admitting here that there is a possibility that no scientific experimentation can be done to ascertain the origin of life. In fact, this particular scientist here concedes the possibility that the evolutionary scenario concerning the origin of life, that it all happened by accident rather than design, that they can't test that. He concedes that. He says they can't test that to prove whether it's true. You know, that's the exact same accusation that people say about God, you know. Well, you know, you shouldn't believe in God because you can't prove God. Well, we're seeing in this class that we can prove God, but they think that we can't. But you see, they can't prove what they believe either. Does everyone get that?
Mm-hmm.
And then Dr. Hazen also says that the notion that man can't figure out how life began on this earth is rather depressing to him because he's devoted so much of his life trying to prove that life could come about from non-living chemicals. And here's what he says next. He says, I guess it's not too surprising then that virtually all origin of life researchers adopt the philosophical view that life is indeed a cosmic imperative. Notice what he says here. We trust that it's only a matter of time before we know how it happened. It is wonderful to think that given the scenario, Genesis occurs throughout the universe all the time. However, we cannot prove that idea until we find a second independent origin of life, either on another world or in the laboratory. So what he's reasoning here is that He says, we know very little about life's origin on Earth. He says there's the possibility that science will never be able to devise an experiment that would prove that life came from non-living chemicals. But then he says, but I've devoted 10 years of my life attempting to find a way to prove that life comes from non-life. And so what I'm doing, what other scientists like me who have devoted their lives to this study, what we're doing, we're just simply assuming that it's possible. We are trusting that it's only a matter of time. And the thing is that his assumption can't simply be granted, because the fact of the matter is evolution could not have occurred without some form of spontaneous generation. And that is why scientists like Dr. Hazen and the Grants and the others that we've looked at today, they have concocted experiments. They have attempted to create life from non-living substances, but even after all of these attempts, life has never been created in the material universe from anything that wasn't already alive. And if you have thousands of scientists, they have designed carefully planned experiments to create life from something that wasn't alive, and every single time they've done it, they failed, then how in the world should we be expected to believe that nature did it using accidents and chance and blind forces? But the flip side of that is that scientists have never documented in nature or in the laboratory a single case of spontaneous generation, but every single day, these same scientists and also you and me, we see it with our own eyes that life comes only from previous life of its own kind. Dogs produce only dogs. There might be changes in what kind of dogs due to microevolution, but macroevolution, where the dog would produce a cat or the cat would produce a fish, no, we never observed that. Dogs produce only dogs, cats produce only cats, cows produce only cows, human beings produce only human beings. That's what science has proved. That's what we see with our own eyes. And that's exactly what the Bible teaches as well. Genesis 1 verse 24, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their own kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their own kinds. And it is so. So don't ever think, whenever you hear someone say that the Bible and science are incompatible, don't believe it. In fact, if next time you hear someone say, well, the Bible is just a bunch of myths and science discredits the Bible, well, remember what we've studied tonight. Because the Bible has been proven to be in line with science over and over again, and it's Darwin's theory of macroevolution that is proven to not be able to provide the evidence for its accuracy here. So the question is, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the evidence that shows, again, that God exists and the Bible is his word, and that the Bible is true? Or are we going to believe theories of man that science itself discredits? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts, any questions that anyone has? I know that this is kind of deep, but again, the class is diving deep, and when you're wanting to tackle Darwin's theory of evolution, you gotta delve into deep waters here. So, any questions anyone has? Anything that I've said tonight that you want me to elaborate on, or that you didn't get the first time? You want an explanation about anything?
I think they tend to lean on that idea of infinite possibilities. If there was infinite amounts of time and infinite number of possibilities, then just by chance, eventually, it would happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you've got infinite number of possible planets that life could exist on, throughout an infinite sized universe, then somewhere it's got to happen. And you know, which when you think of it logically, that kind of makes sense. But then again, there's not an infinite number of planets, and there's not, and the, like you were looking at the number earlier, that number is so large of the chances of things just occurring by chance that it doesn't mathematically make sense.
That's a very good point. That's very true. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, well, this will be the last class that we're going to have this year. So we will pick this up again in about, well, I guess 3 weeks. The first Monday in January, and I think that's January 4th, if I'm not mistaken. And so I hope all of you all have a good Christmas holiday. If you're traveling anywhere, I hope that you stay safe. And I want to thank you all for attending. Okay, I hope it was beneficial.
Thanks for the class, John.
All right. Well, you guys take it easy. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will see you all in January. Okay.
All right, you too.
All right. Take it easy.
See you.